Here in the Austrian Alps, 3,500 years ago, expert Bronze Age miners dug deep shafts and galleries down into the mountain. In the flickering light cast by tapers and oil lamps, wearing tough leather shoes and protective headwear, they climbed down timber scaffolds, ladders and stairways hewn from the pine trees felled on the slopes above. They excavated using stone hammers and bronze picks, hauling their prize to the surface in baskets and bags. But these ancient miners were not pursuing veins of copper or tin ores down here in the darkness. Instead, they were chasing another precious substance known as halite, or rock salt. Extracting and trading this valuable resource helped make the chiefs of the region rich and powerful, as the Bronze Age became the Iron Age and their Proto-Celtic culture transformed Europe. But this wasn't the first place in Europe to grow rich from the production and trade of salt. Thousands of years earlier, during the Neolithic, the first farmers of Europe founded a settlement over a salt deposit that was so prized the town would be occupied for 1,000 years as it transformed into a fortress to protect this valuable substance and the riches it provided. Across prehistoric Europe, there were different kinds of salt sources, extraction methods and processing techniques carried out from the brine springs of the Carpathians to the rock salt mines of the Alps and the salt marshes of eastern England. But what was all this salt used for? Who did the hard work at these sites and who might have ruled over them? And how did salt production and trade transform these societies from the Neolithic to the Iron Age? This is the surprising story of how salt transformed prehistoric Europe. This video is sponsored by Raycon. I use these headphones every day. They're Raycon's Everyday Earbuds Classic, which now have active noise cancellation. I use them at the gym every time I work out, where I listen mainly to music released in 1994. The active noise cancellation on this model really helps to block out the appalling playlists they always have blasting at the gym, so I can concentrate on listening to Caius, Soundgarden, Future Sound of London and other highly respectable 90s classics. I also walk 5 miles a day or more, and I usually listen to audiobooks or research papers while I'm walking. These books are pretty long and there's always a lot of papers to get through, but fortunately the gel tips on these earbuds are comfortable to wear for long periods at a time, and the batteries give you 8 hours of playtime, so I never run out of battery. If you like the sound of them, please use my link in the description below to get yourself your Everyday Earbuds Classic model now with active noise cancellation. Go to buyraycon.com/Dan Davis to get 20% off fan favourite Everyday Earbuds Classic, sponsored by Raycon. We take salt for granted today. It's so easy to shake it, grind it or sprinkle it onto your food, whether it's table salt, sea salt flakes or ground rock salt. This salt is sodium chloride, and for us animals it's far more than just seasoning. Sodium and chloride ions are fundamental to our biological functions. Without adequate salt intake, we can get symptoms like fatigue and muscle weakness, and a severe lack of sodium would ultimately be fatal. Fortunately, it's an abundant mineral, naturally occurring in the environment, and our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have got adequate sodium from the diets they ate, especially from the meat and blood of the animals they hunted, and from certain plants they collected. The amount of salt found in the soil and taken up by plants, and the animals that eat them, varies depending on geography. Salt is of course mostly found dissolved in seawater, and generally there will be more salt in soils closer to the coast. It's possible that during the Paleolithic and Mesolithic, hunter-gatherer groups made intentional journeys to salt-rich regions to ensure their continued good health, in a similar way to how animals instinctively go to salt licks and consume mineral-rich clays when they need to. But this kind of behaviour doesn't generally leave detectable archaeological evidence. The salty waters off Europe's coast weren't the only salt sources available, however. Sodium chloride forms a stable crystalline mineral we call halite. There are massive underground deposits all over the world that were once ancient salty seas, perhaps hundreds of millions of years ago. These can be in complex layers between sedimentary rock and can form salt domes over geological timescales that can reach the surface or near enough to access with quarrying. Mining these formations was very rarely done in prehistory, but these underground deposits can interact with groundwater, dissolving the halite and coming to the surface in natural brine springs. It might be that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers utilised these brine springs, and there have been attempts to map Mesolithic activity in the form of stone tool finds, for example, to known brine spring locations. Because Mesolithic people didn't tend to change their environment very much in ways we can see archaeologically, we can't really see how they processed the brine, or if they did at all. But there is some evidence from southeast France. Pieces of worked timber from a brine well have been radiocarbon dated to about 5700 BC, the end of the Mesolithic era in this region. The timbers might have formed a small enclosure for solar brine evaporation, the sun slowly evaporating standing brine to leave the salt residue behind, which could then be harvested. And at the same sort of time, perhaps even earlier, to the east, the first farms of Europe were spreading through the Balkans. Groups expanded along the river valleys looking for new lands to colonise. It's thought that these early agricultural societies might have sought out additional salt sources, especially if their diets relied more on cereal crops than meat, and especially as they moved away from coastal regions. They would have likely had to provide their animal herds with additional salt too. This may have meant accessible salt sources were one of the considerations when founding a new settlement, along with access to other resources like fresh water, timber and clay. Because of the underlying halite deposits, the eastern Carpathian region has many salt springs. The site called Poiana Slatina in Romania, which means salt spring meadow or clearing, has been called the earliest salt production site in the world, although other places claim that title too. The oldest radiocarbon date estimate goes back to 6000 BC. And this is the earliest appearance of a type of salt processing artifact called briquetage. This is the term given to a coarse ceramic specifically produced for the boiling of salt. These pots were smashed open to access the salt cakes inside, and so were single use, leaving great mounds of waste over time. Enormous quantities of these ceramics were produced at some processing sites in prehistoric Europe, and these landmarks have been noticed for a long time. The name briquetage was coined in 1740 by a French military engineer and antiquarian who noted these mounds of brick-like material where he was working in eastern France. Here in the Carpathian region, this salt production technique was in use from the first Neolithic settlements onwards into the Chalcolithic era. Different brine springs have different concentrations of salt, and these can change depending on the season and rainfall. And the salts could have been collected and used as brine. Certainly that's one way local people continued to use the brine springs into modern times, pouring brine into soups and being used to preserve dairy and so on. But to make salt crystals, the water had to be evaporated. So from the Neolithic onwards, ceramic containers made of local clay were filled with brine and gently heated by fire to evaporate the water, leaving behind salt crystals inside. The ceramic container was then broken open, leaving the salt cakes to be collected, transported, stored and used. These broken chunks of ceramic were discarded, and these remains are what archaeologists call briquetage. And briquetage is generally the best form of archaeological evidence for prehistoric salt production, as it's found at sites right across Europe for thousands of years, from the Neolithic into the Iron Age, although it was not the only technique used. Probably at these Neolithic sites, the work was seasonal and small scale, produced by and for the local settlement. Salt would have been used to season the food of people and animals, of course, and also for the preservation of meat and in the processing of hides. Improving nutritional storage like this might have helped these communities better survive seasonal food shortages. Better health would have fueled the population growth seen at this time. As the Neolithic societies here developed metalworking and other new technologies in an era we call the Chalcolithic, they also became more complex societies that saw craft specializations within and between settlements and the development of long-range trade networks. Settlements in this era reached into new territories as they sought to control specific resources like copper ores, and they were usually protected with defences like banks, ditches and palisades, sometimes at a huge scale. And one remarkable settlement we know of near Provadia in Bulgaria seems to have specialised in salt production. This is the location of the only large salt deposit in the region. Salt extraction has been carried out here for thousands of years, and the salt springs here were first exploited in the Neolithic, perhaps around 5500 BC. The huge occupation layer here, known as a tell, is named Solnitsata, or the Salt Works, and it's sometimes called Europe's oldest town. Clay ovens and ceramic pots were used within the Neolithic settlement and at the nearby brine springs to produce salt. Occupation and salt processing continued into the late Chalcolithic to around 4500 to 4200 BC, which is when the whole region saw systemic decline. This site was part of the Chalcolithic trade networks that exchanged gold and copper from the Balkan Mountains, spondylus and other shells from the Aegean, and other resources like obsidian, all as raw materials and in the form of finished tools and ornaments. Just 40 kilometers away from Solnitsata was the famous Varna Cemetery, the site with the oldest gold treasure in the world, the burial site of the world's first elite metalworkers and chiefs, buried with an abundance of metal weapons and ornaments. The settlement here at Solnitsata was protected by fortifications like a defensive ditch or moat, stone walls, stone bastions, and wooden palisades. It's these encircling defences and the economic and trade specialisation that leads some to conceive of the site as a kind of proto-urban settlement or town. There's also evidence of ritual activity taking place here and nearby, and a Vinca culture-style model mask has been discovered. Excavations are carried out for 2 months every summer, and there's still an enormous amount to be uncovered. You read about places like this, and you can't help but imagine what life would have been like for those living here over 6,000 years ago. The population was probably only a few hundred people at any one time. Their work would have included collecting and transporting the brine, cutting timber for the fires, collecting clay for the ovens, and for making the evaporation jars. They would have made bags and baskets for transporting the salt cakes, and built and crewed boats for paddling their produce along the river for trade with neighbours like the metallurgic masters of Varna. You wonder what their spiritual beliefs were like, what they thought about the nature of this special substance that emerged from the earth, surely like a gift from the gods of the underworld. The other site that fires my imagination is over 1,000 kilometers away to the northwest and dates to the Bronze Age, the salt mines of Hallstatt. There's a surprising amount of research on prehistoric salt once you start looking. The best single overview is the book by Anthony Harding. There's another popular book called Salt: A World History by Mark Kalansky, which is a pretty fun read. And there's many academic publications about specific sites or regions. As always, I'll leave some key sources in the description below. In the Bronze Age in Europe, most salt was obtained through salt springs and by processing seawater in coastal regions. I'll talk more about that later, but both methods used briquetage to evaporate the brine by heating. Some places though also mined halite, rock salt, directly. Probably there were places quarrying exposed halite where it was accessible at the surface. Most places that did that have continued being quarried, and so all ancient workings have long since been obliterated. But there are a few hints here and there still surviving, like from Transylvania and Ukraine, where wooden troughs with holes in the bottom have been discovered and were used somehow in salt processing. Hollowed out tree trunks from Romania have been dated to the Bronze Age, between the 16th and the 9th centuries BC. There was industrial level processing in this region, involving clay-lined wicker tanks, some of them with roofs, to store brine. The troughs they carved might have been used to drip fresh water onto rock salt deposits below. The holes along the troughs had wooden plugs, themselves with tiny holes in that held twisted cords dangling down, dissolving sections of the exposed halite directly beneath the drips, creating weak points that could be cracked open and pried apart. This has been tested and it actually works, by the way. Another hypothesis that has been tested and found to work is that they poured brine into the troughs and let it drip out slowly, perhaps onto textiles below where salt crystals would form for collection. Proper mining, digging shafts and galleries beneath the ground, was a highly skilled and dangerous activity. Most prehistoric mineworks, like copper and tin mines for example, were destroyed by later mining activities in the same area, and that probably happened to salt mines too. However, in the famous salt region of Hallstatt in Austria, some of the prehistoric mine workings survived. Most of them are from the Iron Age, when the salt mining intensified in scale, but they started deep salt mining here in the Bronze Age, as far back as 1450 BC. Wooden structures were built underground, like scaffolds, and this surviving staircase, which has been called the oldest surviving wooden staircase in the world. The timber for it was felled in 1344 BC. What's left of it is 1.8 meters wide and 8 meters long. You can tell by the angle of the treads that it was steeper in its original position, and it might have been built to let miners cross heaps of mining spoil. There are other parts of staircases found in the mines too. The high salt content of the mine's atmosphere severely restricts microbial activity, preserving organic material, including wooden tools and leather clothing. We don't know for sure who would have worked down here in the flickering light of these spruce and fir tapers and oil lamps, but the salt mine was of vital importance for the people that controlled it in the Urnfield period. These people are known from the thousands of Bronze Age and Iron Age burials here. The extraordinary abundance of graves, human remains, and material culture in the form of grave goods has provided an enormous insight into the era, the early Iron Age especially. This huge cemetery gave its name to the Proto-Celtic Hallstatt culture, which was enormously important and influential right across Europe. The Bronze Age saw the emergence of chiefly elites who would grow in power throughout the era through control of local resources, such as salt from the mines here in Hallstatt and nearby Doomburg near Hallein, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of warlords wielding bronze and then iron swords. In the Iron Age, say between around 800 BC to 100 BC, salt production reached an unprecedented scale and sophistication right across Europe. Technological advancements and population growth drove demand and supply, and increasingly complex societies required both reliable food preservation and commodities for exchange. Most of the archaeological evidence for European salt production comes from this era. There were salt production sites in Mediterranean coastal regions where sea salt could be evaporated by the power of the sun alone. But in northwestern Europe, it was too cold even in summer to do that. And this is where archaeologists and antiquarians discovered these great mounds of smashed briquetage at sites where seawater was concentrated and evaporated. In eastern England, these mounds of brick-coloured debris were called red hills. One of the highest concentrations of these ancient structures was in coastal Essex. The stretch of the River Blackwater between the town of Malden and Mersey Island has long been famous for salt production. It's home today to one of the world's premier sea salt brands, Malden Sea Salt. The salt marshes along the north banks of this tidal river, through the local currents and tides, and the repeated inundations and evaporations have accumulated a high concentration of salt. The creeks here are so salty that traditionally boys from across the area were brought here to learn to swim, benefiting from the increased buoyancy provided by the salt. And the air and soil is so rich in salt that local orchards better survive late frosts. And the sheep and cattle reared on the salt marsh are especially healthy and delicious. The salt works here continued in different forms through the Middle Ages into the modern period, shaping the character of these places and the people. There are villages and streets named after salt, and the salty creeks and salt marshes create this landscape that's not the sea, but isn't quite land either. In the Iron Age, the communities here likely produced salt seasonally and at relatively small scale. They used different methods to concentrate the salt, from digging a series of clay-lined pits to using wooden troughs, and finally boiling the brine in ceramics and creating the mounds of briquetage later antiquarians named Red Hills. there are over 300 red hills known from Essex alone. Similar sites can be found dating to the Iron Age and the Roman period of Britain right across England, usually concentrated in estuaries. As well as for local production, the resulting salt was traded inland to the population centres where demand for salt was highest. Different techniques were often used at different contemporary sites, suggesting that idiosyncratic methods were developed and passed down through families and communities, even when contemporary sites were so close they were in view of one another. These mounds of spoil, created over generations, remind me a bit of Mesolithic shell middens created by hunter-gatherers. On one level, it was just a pile of industrial waste, but on another, it was a monument to your work and to your ancestors who had stood where you stood and had done the work that you were doing and had passed on their skills and wisdom through the ages. There's some suggestion they did see the Red Hills a bit like this, with possible ritual depositions and even nearby burials relating to the Red Hills, seemingly attaching some ritual spiritual significance to these structures. Today, the Red Hills of Essex have been flattened by seawall flood defences and ploughed flat by farmers, but fragments of briquetage can still be seen on the surface, at the edge of the ploughed land or in the sea wall, or eroding from the muddy banks of the salt marsh. Coastal production complemented inland mining and salt spring exploitation, meaning that from the Iron Age onwards, salt was widely available across much of prehistoric Europe. These distinctive local traditions would often continue into the Roman and later historical periods, when large-scale salt pans were established on Mediterranean and Atlantic coastlines, some of which continue to be used today. There's this phrase or idea that you see repeated sometimes that in the ancient world, salt was more valuable than gold. I think most people know that that was never the case, and this idea may have come from a misunderstanding of the trans-Saharan trade, where gold was plentiful and salt was harder to come by. But salt could have great value in prehistory, depending on the time and place, and some communities and some people would have grown wealthy and powerful from its production and trade. It's something we take for granted today, but for some of our ancestors, as far back as 8,000 years ago, as they transformed this special substance through complex processes, so salt had the power to transform their communities, helped shape their ways of life, and influence the course of European history. If you like these kinds of videos, please subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this in future, and your subscription really helps me out too. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. Your contributions help me to obtain all this wonderful footage of ancient sites and the salt marshes of Essex. If you haven't joined yet, please do so using the links in the description below. Now, to find out more about prehistoric mining, please watch this video on the largest copper mine of the ancient world, the incredible Mines of Kargali. Thank you for watching.